Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Daisy's Dilemma by Emma Ashwood. Prologue, New York State, June 1862. Daisy Jones' mother could not be happier for her daughter now that she had finally secured herself a reputable husband-to-be. Daisy knew her mother, Anna, only wanted her to marry John Smithers because she would be more respected in the community, which had been her mother's life goal. Eager as she always was to impress or outdo her friends and those who moved within her social circles, everyone wanted their daughter to marry someone with wealth and standing. At the age of 21, she felt ready to marry and start a family of her own. She lived with her parents, and as much as she loved them dearly, she was ready to become more independent. She had always been fortunate to live a comfortable life with her mother and father, Matthew, who was a store owner. He worked long hours for the benefit of his family. They had never been rich, but she had also never wanted for anything. Daisy was very close to her father, and she had a suspicion that he did not like her fiancé as much as her mother did. She could tell from the suspicious glances he made towards John and the quietness that fell over him each time her mother gushed over how wonderful he was. It was not something they had discussed, and Daisy didn't want to ask him about it. She wanted to marry and didn't want anything to stand in her way. She knew that John was a good man with good prospects, and that was enough for her. She was the envy of the town. Daisy did wonder occasionally why John had not already married. He was 4 years her senior, and she thought he must have had plenty of opportunity previously. Perhaps he had just been waiting for the right person to come along, she told herself when he had proposed 2 months ago. They were due to be wed in 2 months at the local church near their homes in New York State. As she looked in the mirror and teased her light blonde hair into position, she wondered what married life would be like. He was accountant. She knew he worked long hours, but she hoped that would change a little when they married and started a family. They certainly would have enough money already, so she would appreciate the time spent together as a family more than she would him working towards even more wealth. Daisy had always been proud of her father, who had always worked hard to ensure they had enough to get by. But she had seen what the long hours of working had done to her mother. With too much time on her hands, Anna had become obsessed with getting more than they already had. She became competitive against the other ladies in their community and wanted to prove herself as a well-respected woman. This had put more and more pressure on her father, who had already been working so hard. Since Daisy had met and become engaged to John, her mother seemed to have laid off her father a little, much to Daisy's relief. Unlike her mother, Daisy had no desire for high life and respected high society circles. She knew she would be just as happy to have a small, contented family with just enough money to keep them comfortable. She hoped John would have the same sentiments as her, but doubted that, given his wealthy upbringing and drive to grow his father's accounting business. Chapter 1. John Smithers stood by the window of his well-appointed office building, observing the bustling town around him as far as the eye could see. With his delicately long fingers clasped together behind his back, he swayed forwards and backward on his heels, a slight smile forming on his lips as he reminded himself of everything he had accomplished for his community at the tender age of 25. In just 2 months, he would be a married man. The thought simultaneously excited and revolted him. Of course, he would have preferred to marry a woman of greater means, rather than just the daughter of a humble storekeeper. However, the women of the town who were of better breeding didn't possess the physical appeal he desired. Daisy, on the other hand, was far more beautiful than any of the women he had met before, ensuring she would make a lovely adornment on his arm and guarantee their children would be very handsome indeed. He was confident that Daisy would make a wonderful mother, and he intended to keep her occupied with an ever-growing family as soon after the wedding as possible. And while she was tending to their children, he would continue the life he had become accustomed to, complete with thrilling gambling escapades and clandestine dalliances with other ladies. He simply could not be tied down to one woman. Although he knew married men were expected to conduct themselves with a certain level of propriety, he refused to be shackled by societal expectations. Discretion, he knew, would be the key to maintaining his freedom and reputation. He jumped as the door opened suddenly behind him, and the bell startled him, bringing him out of his thoughts and back into the ornate room. "Young Mr. Smithers, I wonder if your father is available," asked the elderly gentleman, whom John recognized as one of the townsfolk who managed the largest factory in town. "I am sure you don't need my father, Mr." He paused expectantly. "Banks, Mr. Banks," he replied, a confused expression on his aging face. "Mr. Banks, what can I do for you today?" John asked, unwilling to allow him to overlook him and go to his father. He had worked in his father's business for over 7 years now, but still felt that same frustration whenever someone would rather speak to his father about business. He was more adept than his father and would not allow people to simply dismiss him. He half listened while Mr. Banks told him about his current troubles, and they discussed how he could be of help. Being the only accountants in town came with its benefits, as everyone had to come to them, and they had to accept whatever they were charged. Although his father had been reluctant to any change, John had secretly been increasing the fees for their work and siphoning the excess money for himself. He would, of course, need more money when he was married and had a family, and he was partial to gambling every now and then. Once he had the business taken care of, overcharging for the initial consultation, John returned to his stance before the window. He loved to watch over his domain, knowing that one day in the not-so-distant future, this would be all his. John expected his father to retire in the coming years. He had always worked tirelessly for very little monetary reward, and this was now taking its toll. The business was successful and they had significant savings, but John had grand ideas for the business. Expansion was needed so that he could live the life of means of which he dreamt, and he knew his father would never allow this while he owned and ran the firm. He stepped to the side of the window abruptly as he saw Mr. Jones step out of his store and glance in his direction. He held his breath as he steadied himself. "It's no good hiding from your father-in-law to be," his father suddenly declared behind him. "You are going to have to find a way to make him like you. Undo the idea you have already given him. He has made his mind up. We will be civil for the sake of Daisy and nothing more. What do I care about a storekeeper's opinion of me?" John asked his bemused-looking father. "Oh, my boy, you have a lot to learn," he responded with a slow shake of his gray-haired head as he took his place in his chair behind his oak desk. "So does he," John spat, referring to Daisy's father. "She is lucky to be marrying me. A storekeeper's daughter marrying an accountant's son is almost unheard of. It is only her beauty which makes this possible, I can assure you, father." "Sometimes, John, I despair at the things you say," his father said quietly, before opening a book and firmly planting his face behind it to indicate the conversation was over. John despised his father's attempts to tell him what to do. He had old-fashioned views, and they needed to move with the times. He only spoke the truth. It was not his fault that some people did not seem partial to hearing the truth. He was a grown man now and did not need to be told what to do, especially not by his father. Nevertheless, he skulked to the side of the curtain and crept along the side of the room to his own chair and desk, where he sat, confident he had not been spotted by Daisy's father. Chapter 2. Matthew knew that man was not good enough for his daughter Daisy. Yes, he might be wealthy and have the promise of a stable future with his family business, but John was too showy for his liking. Matthew had never taken to arrogant people and wondered how John had become this way when his father was so grounded and down to earth. His store being across the way from their business was both a blessing and a curse. Matthew could keep an eye on the man who would marry his daughter, but it also meant he was always around. He was always standing at that window, peering out across town, as though he owned it all. He was always amused when John crept out of the way and hid behind the curtain whenever he stepped outside of his own store. He must think Matthew couldn't see him, but of course he could, and his immature reactions made him all the more suspicious of the man. He wished his wife had been less insistent on Daisy marrying John. He knew she had her own agenda, but surely the needs and happiness of their child should take precedence over everything else. Somehow Anna had become a snob and wanted nothing more than to be seen as the most powerful woman in town. He feared this would never happen, and she would never be happy. He just wanted a quiet, peaceful life, so he went along with her ways, attending dinner parties with her and hosting grand events, the aim of which was only to impress. Bringing all of the outdoor items into the shop, he thought about his precious daughter. She was so beautiful, inside and out, and she deserved the best in life. But he knew that didn't mean money. That meant how others treated her, and he feared John would not treat her the way she deserved. But Daisy had assured him that she was happy and that she wanted nothing more than to marry John, so he could not stand in her way. He would always support his daughter, even if her decisions differed from the ones he would make for her. Isn't that the role of a father? To always be there for their child and support them through good and bad decisions. He would continue to be civil to the man, show his disdain when he saw him flirting with other women, as he had already, and try to help him become a better man if he had the opportunity. Matthew knew that John's father was a good man, and despaired that if he had failed to bring out the best in his son, maybe he was a lost cause. Chapter 3. As he watched his 2-year-old baby girl toddling around the garden, his heart soared with love for her. They had been through a tough time together, having lost her mother, his beloved wife, Connie, during childbirth. Edward Black felt deep gratitude that his daughter had made it through the birth and that they had been able to build their lives together. Edward knew that with each day that passed, his daughter Annabella's need for a mother in her life would grow. But he had no desire to replace his late wife, whom he had loved so much. They had been childhood sweethearts, and he knew no one could replace her. But he also knew he needed to put his daughter's needs ahead of his own. He marveled at his daughter's golden blonde hair and bright blue eyes, so much like her mother's. Edward waved to his daughter when she waved at him from across the garden, using her whole chubby little arm. There were certain things that he knew only a mother could do for their daughter. Only a mother could teach a daughter. He looked back to his friend Jake, who sat beside him on his ranch house porch. "I guess you're right, Jake," he conceded, a small smile on his face. "Of course I'm right, Edward. It has been 2 years. That girl needs a mother, and you need a wife. You can't run this ranch all alone forever," Jake declared. "I'm not alone. I have help," he responded defensively, referring to the 5 ranch hands he had taken on over the past few years. He did not want his friend to think he was not able to manage his own cattle ranch, which had grown beyond all expectations in the years since they lost Connie. When the cattle bred beyond his wildest dreams, he took comfort that she might just be looking over them. "Well, that may well be true, but you sure ain't got a wife," Jake pointed out. "Who's going to want a 30-year-old man with a baby?" Edward asked seriously. "You'd be surprised what women want these days," Jake said reassuringly, before adding, "It seems they will take anything nowadays." And he burst into laughter as Edward jabbed at his arm playfully. Annabella came rushing over to see what all the commotion was about before she joined in their play too. Edward knew he was lucky to have a friend like Jake. He looked out for him and told him what he needed to know without holding back. He was also great with his baby and had really helped the pair to get through the difficulties after Connie's death. Later that evening, once Annabella was soundly asleep and the only sounds were that of nature all around his vast fields, Edward sat on the porch to cool down after the scorching day. He wished he had his parents around. His father would have known how to guide him in the right direction, and his mother would have helped with the care of the baby. But they had both died almost 10 years ago, within a year of each other. He thought his father died of a broken heart after his mother passed away from cholera. He thought again about what Jake had said. He agreed they needed a woman around the house, but he didn't want just any woman. He needed to be sure she would be great with Annabella and that they could, over time, find love together. He had no desire to be in a loveless marriage after the wonderful experience of his first marriage. He wanted his daughter to witness real love. The Matrimonial Times newspaper came to mind, not for the first time. He wondered if this might be the fastest and most efficient way for him to find a wife. By exchanging letters over time, he surely would get to know the nature of the woman and if she shared his morals, dreams, and aspirations. Jake had told him about a friend of his who had done the same a few months prior, and they had already married. Edward decided he would place an advertisement for a mail-order bride in the Matrimonial Times the very next day. Chapter 4. Daisy awoke feeling inexplicably uneasy in the pit of her stomach. She quickly washed and dressed, eager to be busy so she could squash down these feelings. Each time she thought about John, she felt her stomach churn. She hoped it was excitement. She had heard people speak of butterflies in their stomach when they saw the person they loved. She hoped it was this. "Good morning, Daisy," her father welcomed her as she entered the kitchen. She smiled in return as she poured herself a cup of hot coffee from the pot on the stove and joined him at the small wooden table. They sat in amicable silence for a short while, sipping the coffee that would wake their brains. This was Daisy's favorite part of the day, sitting in silence with her beloved father. She would miss this when she was married and living in the Smithers household. John's mother had passed away when John was only 8 years old, so she suspected their home might need some attention when she moved in. She was expecting to be very busy with the upkeep of the home, but hoped she would have time to visit with her father regularly, maybe even the occasional early morning coffee visits. "Your mother will be down soon," Matthew said, his voice low and gruff. "Yes," Daisy acknowledged, the uneasiness growing in her stomach again, making her wonder if it could be the butterflies she had heard of. "I am seeing Mary today, so I will probably start making my way into town soon." "You can't avoid her forever," he replied with a wink of his eye and a small smile on his thin lips. Daisy smiled back and rolled her eyes dramatically, which made his smile broaden. "I'm not avoiding Mother at all. I am just a very busy lady, getting ready for my wedding." "That is all," she tried to explain, but her father knew her too well and was having none of it. "Is that so? What else do you have planned today that has made you seeing Mary so early in the day?" His teasing eyes twinkled in the morning sun that was peeping through the window. "Mary was busy later, actually," she retorted, becoming frustrated. He looked at her calmly and patiently. "Fine. It's just that Mother will speak of nothing but our upcoming wedding and what this means for her. It's exhausting," she whispered animatedly. Matthew nodded his head in agreement. "I know. She is just excited for you. For herself, more like," Daisy heard herself say before she gasped and her delicate hand flew up to her mouth. It was too late. Her father already had that disappointed look on his face. "Sorry, Father. I didn't mean to say that." "You can tell me anything, Daisy. But be careful not to be disrespectful or rude. We brought you up to be better than that." Daisy nodded her head shamefully in agreement, annoyed at herself for being so careless with her words. She looked into her father's eyes, eager for his forgiveness. A small smile formed on his mouth, which spread to his eyes. "Even if what you say has some truth in it." Another wink of his eye, and Daisy knew the matter would be forgotten. "I just would like to talk about other things sometimes, too. Some days it feels like it is all about the wedding, and we've still got almost 2 months to go," Daisy tried to explain. "I know, I understand. But I thought a bride-to-be would want nothing more than to talk about her big day all of the time?" he asked tentatively, and Daisy could see that look in his eyes. She knew he was checking whether she still wanted to go ahead with the marriage without actually asking. She loved him for it. "Oh yes, I do love to plan and talk about it, but sometimes Mother can just be a little too much. Do you know what I mean?" she asked carefully. To 7 Rep Plant. She knew her parents loved each other and was always cautious not to play them off against each other. "I sure do, honey. She means well," he stated, and Daisy knew he was right. "I am heading off to the store now. Do you want to walk with me?" he asked as he pulled his tall frame up from his chair. "Sure. Let me just grab my purse," she replied as she rushed back up the stairs, only to return moments later with her purse in hand, and they began their walk together. It was only about a 30-minute walk into town. The sun was shining and the birds were singing happily. Daisy loved mornings like this. It always felt so peaceful and relaxing. She linked arms with her father, and they walked at the same pace, her shorter legs working to keep up until they fell into a comfortable rhythm. They chatted at times, but mainly enjoyed the sounds of nature around them. When they arrived at the store, Daisy kissed her father on the cheek and wished him a good day. "See your mother after you have spent time with Mary," he responded. "She will be upset if she thinks you are avoiding her." He was right, Daisy knew, so she nodded her head in agreement and vowed to herself that she would return home later and spend time with her mother. Maybe a morning with Mary would put her in the right frame of mind to talk about weddings all afternoon with her mother. Daisy glanced over at the building housing the accounting business, but knew it was too early for her to see John there. They opened at 9 in the morning, whereas her father opened at 8. She sauntered down the street until she reached the cafeteria where she and Mary always met for a catch-up. It was the only place in town that opened so early. She made her way to their usual table in the window, ordering a coffee on her way. As she sat down, she felt a pang of guilt at the little white lie she had told her father. Mary was not due to arrive in town for another hour yet. She just couldn't face her mother and her barrage of requests about the wedding. Not so early in the morning, and not when she felt such unease in her stomach. Daisy enjoyed the coffee alone, watching out of the window as the townsfolk started to rise and go about their day. The friends loved to sit in the window so they could watch the world go by and observe the strange things people often do. They found it most amusing, although they were very discreet, of course. The door flew open and in came Mary Bustle, Daisy's oldest friend. Daisy stood and the pair embraced. "Shall we move to a table out back a bit?" asked Mary, a fixed smile on her face, which did not help the unease Daisy had already been feeling. "Why?" Daisy asked cautiously, suspicion written all over her face. "We always sit right here, watch the world go by. Are you all right?" she asked, suddenly worried for her friend. Maybe she had some bad news or private matters to speak of. Daisy stood and followed her tall, slim friend to the back of the room, and they took their places at a different table. They made small talk while they waited for their coffee and breakfast of eggs and hotcakes to arrive. Daisy felt the unease growing inside her as her mind went into overdrive as to what might be wrong with her friend. She knew her cheeks were flushed, and their conversation was not flowing in the usual comfortable way. There were even some unheard-of, uncomfortable silences between the pair, which she didn't recall ever happening before. Daisy struggled to eat her breakfast, simply moving the food about her plate once she had cut it. She noticed Mary had barely eaten hers either, and any time Daisy made mention of John, her husband-to-be, she noticed a change in Mary. "Mary, what is it? Please put me out of my misery. Are you ill? Are you moving away? What is going on?" Daisy pleaded as she pushed her uneaten plate of food away from her and sipped her coffee anxiously. "Daisy, dearest Daisy, I simply don't know how to tell you." Daisy noticed her friend's green eyes fill with tears. "I am perfectly well and not going anywhere, but I have something I need to tell you, and I am sorry, but it is going to upset you deeply." The tears fell from her eyes, and Mary dabbed at them with her handkerchief. "Whatever could it be?" she asked Mary, completely confused and now scared. "You can tell me anything, you know that? I have heard some gossip about your John. Apparently, he has been boasting to the young clerk at the accounting firm that he has been having affairs with other women behind your back." Mary stared at Daisy, awaiting a reaction, but Daisy didn't know what to do or how to respond. Surely there was some misunderstanding. "No, that's impossible. He is always working, Mary." "When would he have the time?" Daisy asked, her own eyes filling with tears now as reality dawned on her. He is not working all of the time that he tells you he is, Daisy. He has lied to you. I am sorry, but I had to tell you. I can't keep something like this from you, no matter how hard it is for you to hear. Mary reached out and took Daisy's hand in her own, her thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. No, Daisy said quietly, I just can't believe he would do this to me. I know, but I am quite sure. I wouldn't tell you and put you through this unless I was definite, Mary said to her friend. Yes, I know, Mary. Thank you for telling me. I think it is just going to take me a moment to get my head around this. Daisy responded quietly, and Mary nodded her head in understanding. Shall we go for a walk? Maybe around the park. It could give you some time and space to have a breather and figure out what you want to do next. And I will be there with you so you can talk to me if you want to, Mary suggested kindly. No, thank you. That's a very kind offer. But if you don't mind, I just want to go home, she replied in somewhat of a daze. Mary nodded in understanding of her friend's decision, and they left the tavern together with a gentle hug before they parted ways. Daisy glanced across at the building in which John worked as she made her way across town toward home. She thought she saw movement within, a twitching curtain perhaps. Ordinarily, she would pass by and pop her head in to say hello, but she couldn't face him today. She looked at her father's store and wanted so desperately to go in to ask for his advice. He always knew what to do. He was a very wise man, but she didn't want to let her father know what her fiancé had done. She was ashamed and embarrassed and knew her father would never forgive John. She turned and continued her journey home. She knew in the pit of her stomach that Mary had told her the truth. She now knew that the unease she had been feeling was her intuition telling her something was not quite right. As she approached their home, Daisy could hear her mother Anna singing to herself in the kitchen. She had been so consumed by her thoughts that she hadn't factored in seeing her mother. Ah, Daisy! Her mother exclaimed happily as she walked through the door, oblivious to her daughter's shaking hands and tearful eyes. Where did you get to so early this morning? I just went to see Mary, Daisy replied quietly as she continued walking, heading towards her room. Well, you're here now. Come, sit, let's talk. Daisy could feel herself losing her calm. She could hear her mother pull out the chairs at the table for them to sit together. I'm actually not feeling too well, Mother. I am just going to have a lie down, she called back, without even turning to look at her mother. She heard a big sigh before Anna responded. All right, I'll be here when you wake up. Daisy knew all too well that would be true. She was always there, always waiting for her. Before her engagement, her mother had been constantly waiting around for her to help her find someone to marry. Now she waited around for her so they could talk about the wedding. It was quite exhausting. Chapter 5. Daisy had not managed to sleep much, her mind so full of thoughts, but she had stayed in her room since she had returned home. She knew her mother would have been waiting for her in the kitchen, and she simply couldn't face her until she knew what she was going to do, so she had hidden out in her room. Whenever she heard her mother approaching, she silently hopped onto her bed and pretended to be asleep. It had been the early hours of the morning when Daisy had finally made her decision about what to do concerning John and what she had discovered about him. Daisy knew she loved John deeply, and separating from him now would devastate her mother, maybe even her father. So she decided that she would pretend to have never been told about his misdemeanors and go ahead with the marriage. It was most likely that John was getting it out of his system before they were married, so she felt confident he would stop once she was his wife. Surely then he would be faithful to her. When she thought about the gossip about town, her cheeks burnt with utter embarrassment and shame. But she knew the town well enough to know that a select few would be talking about them, and the information would never get back to her parents. They would soon be talking about somebody else. Once she was washed and dressed, Daisy descended the staircase and braced herself for a confrontation with her mother. She knew her father would have left for the day already, saying as he often would that the store wouldn't run itself. Oh, here she is, her mother exclaimed as she walked through the door into the kitchen heated by the warmth of mid-morning. Daisy was startled as she heard a wooden chair scrape the floor to the right of them and was surprised to see her father sitting there, his face etched with concern. "Father, what are you doing here? What about the store?" She wondered if she had actually slept and had lost track of days. "I was worried about you. Your mother said you had been in bed all day yesterday. Are you all right?" he asked as he stood and approached her. She allowed herself to fall into her father's arms, and they stood for a moment in a warm, comforting embrace. Daisy had to fight to keep tears from falling from her eyes. Matthew put his big hands on her shoulders and pushed her away from him so he could have a look at her. "I feel much better now. Don't worry. I think maybe I was just overtired," she responded, feeling guilty that she was telling another white lie. She glanced over to her mother, who was clearing the table and seemed not to be interested at all in their conversation. She had never been the most maternal of mothers, and Daisy knew the previous day that she had likely been annoyed with her rather than concerned. "That's good to hear," he said, relief and fatherly love filling his kind eyes. "You need to get to work. You can't leave the store closed just because of me. Honestly, I am fine. Get on your way," she declared, a broad smile on her face to reassure him. He nodded his agreement, kissed his wife on the head, and then left with a small wave of his hand. "Coffee?" her mother offered, to which Daisy nodded her acceptance and pulled out a chair to sit down. She could avoid this no longer, and now that she had decided whether to go ahead and marry John, she felt ready to talk about the big day. Daisy spent the morning with her mother, and they had a surprisingly enjoyable time. They chatted about the wedding and beyond. Anna's excitement was infectious, and Daisy soon found herself caught up in it. "I'm going to pop into town now, if you don't mind," she asked her mother just after they had eaten lunch together. "Of course. I have plenty to do here. I have a dress to resize for the bride-to-be." Percent. "Why couldn't you have been big-boned too?" her mother joked in reference to her daughter's tiny frame. "Thank you, Mother. I really appreciate it. It will mean so much for me to wear your wedding dress on my own wedding day, knowing how happy you two have always been," Daisy expressed, as she gave her mother a quick embrace and then headed into town. Daisy knew Mary would be at the shoemaker's in town that afternoon, as she had said she was having shoes mended. She wanted to see Mary so she could explain what she had decided to do, and she hoped Mary would be supportive. She also wanted to ask her best friend what she had wanted to ask her the day before, if she would be her bridesmaid. She hoped she would still be willing, even after what she had learned of her husband-to-be. "Ah, Daisy," Mary exclaimed as she walked through the door to the shoemaker's. "Let's walk. My shoes won't be ready for an age yet." Mary jumped up from her chair and linked arms with her best friend as she led her out the door with a quick wave over her shoulder as she left the shoemaker. They walked to the park and sat on the first bench they came to. It was a mild day and fortunately not too hot for them to sit in the sunlight. "You're going to stay with him, aren't you?" Mary asked before Daisy had a chance to begin the explanation she had practiced. "Yes, I am, Mary. You know me so well," Daisy responded as she put her head down in shame. "I figured you'd be crying or bleary-eyed at least if you had decided to leave him. I'm not judging you. If that's what you want to do, I understand." "Really, I do. You have to do what you think is right," Mary reassured her, a hand on her left shoulder. "Thank you, Mary," Daisy replied, genuinely grateful for her friend's kindness and understanding. "I think he's just getting it out of his system before we get married. He won't do it then, I am sure." Mary nodded hopefully, in support of her friend's decision. "Did you speak with your ma or pa about it?" Mary inquired, to which Daisy shook her head. "That is fine. I won't mention a thing to anyone. As for the gossip, well, it'll be old news very soon, and they'll lose interest." "That's what I thought," Daisy agreed. "So, what I wanted to meet you for yesterday before all of that happened was to ask you if you would be my bridesmaid, Mary." Mary gasped, her long-fingered hand flying to her face in shock. "That's if you would still be willing to be under the circumstances?" "Of course, I will," Mary exclaimed. "I will be your bridesmaid, not John's. I would be honored to be able to be with you on your most special day." The pair squeezed each other's hands affectionately. Suddenly, their excitement was interrupted by a shout across the park. "Daisy! Hey, Daisy!" They watched as John rushed across the gardens of the park, and Daisy stood as he arrived at their bench. "Whatever is wrong?" she asked. "Are you all right?" he asked, out of breath after the short run. "Why? Yes, of course. Why do you ask?" She feared he knew she had been told about the gossip. She didn't know if she could go ahead with the wedding if the news was public knowledge. The shame could be too much. "Your father didn't open the store until very late this morning. My father went over to check he was all right, even though I told him that was a nosy thing to do." Daisy smiled to herself, knowing that John's father was just being caring and considerate, qualities his son may have missed out on. "He said you weren't well, so he stayed off work to see you were fine. And now I see you chatting on a bench." He glanced down at Mary. The pair were not friends and dismissed each other frequently. They tolerated each other for the sake of Daisy. "I am fine. I was just a little overtired, I think," she replied, feeling touched that he had been concerned about her. "Oh, right," he retorted abruptly. "Well, I hope there will be none of these histrionics when we are married. I won't be taking valuable time off work, that's for sure." And with that, he turned on his heel and strode back to his office. Daisy's heart sank as she realized he had not been worried about her at all, but about her ability to be a good wife and not affect his working life negatively. She looked across at Mary, who had her eyes on the ground. Chapter 6. With only 2 weeks to go until the wedding, William, John's father, was seated on the large porch outside their home, considering what he knew about his son and the kind of husband and father he hoped he would be. He was worried that John had become damaged in some way by the passing of his mother when he was so young. He had done the best he could under the circumstances, but John seemed hardened somehow and had an abrupt outlook on life. An outlook he feared would infiltrate his marriage in a bad way. William had known the Jones family for most of his life, having grown up with Matthew and Anna in this relatively small town. He had always liked them, although Anna seemed to have changed a great deal over recent years. They had all remained friends, and he wanted to be sure his son was going to treat their daughter with the dignity and respect she deserved. He was pulled from his thoughts by the sounds of a horse and carriage approaching. He stood and leaned against the wooden frame of the porch, waiting to see who could be visiting unannounced. He knew John was at the office, so no one would be arriving to see him. An elderly man jumped down from his place up front of the carriage and rushed to help the traveler alight. William was intrigued to see Mrs. Temple descend from the carriage in all her splendor. Once her feet were firmly on the ground, she appeared rooted to the spot, despite having seen William waiting for her to approach him. The elderly man hurriedly pulled a covering of heavy material from the carriage, which he quickly laid on the ground in front of the wealthy woman. Having laid a path for her, covering the dirt track beneath, she made her way to the wooden porch, where she held out her hand to William to help her onto the steps. He stepped forward and obliged, confused as to why she had come to visit since she had never done so before. Maybe her presence was due to the fact that she had not been invited to the wedding, he thought. "Good day, Mr. Smithers," she said coolly as he guided her to a chair on the porch, next to the one he had been sitting on before her arrival. "Good day, Mrs. Temple. Please call me William," he responded as he took his seat next to her. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" "Very well. Then you should call me Susan. I won't stay for long. I have a proposition for you," she said abruptly. She was renowned for not beating around the bush and getting to the point, so he was not surprised by her tone. "Interesting," he replied, sitting up to give her his full attention. "I heard your son is to marry." He nodded his agreement, now convinced she wanted an invitation and regretting not sending her one in the first place. "As you know, I am a very wealthy woman. Very wealthy indeed. In fact, I am the richest woman in town since my husband passed away." She paused for effect, he assumed. If she knew William at all, she would know that he was unimpressed by money and had never needed much to get by, which is why the business had been doing so well. He just wished the same could be said for his son. "Very well. What does that have to do with my son's wedding, ma'am?" he asked, as politely as could be. "I want your son to marry my youngest daughter. Elizabeth is 25 years old, the same age as your son. But she is not a handsome woman. She is quite pale, very tall, with lanky hair, and she is often unwell, which is most likely why she has never married. She is shy and rather uninteresting, I am afraid. But, as you know, my son is set to marry the Jones girl in just 2 weeks," William replied, most confused by the woman's words. He found it most unnecessary for a mother to talk about her daughter in such a way. She waved her hand dismissively. "I believe your son likes money, Mr. Smithers. Don't we all?" she mused. "Whoever chooses to marry my daughter will also be the benefactor of a great dowry in income each year, for the rest of his life. He would be set for life. A very comfortable and privileged life for sure," she stated, trying to entice him in. "I believe my son is marrying for love and would not be swayed by money," William pointed out, hoping he was right. "From what I have heard, your son loves money more than anything else. I believe he has big plans for your accounting firm once you leave it to him, and he won't be able to achieve those dreams without financial backing. I wonder if the option of great wealth would sway him in his decision to marry the pretty Miss Jones." Susan looked him in the eyes, which made him quite uncomfortable. She was perfectly composed, showing no emotion or empathy whatsoever. He wondered what had made her that way. "I simply have to get her off my hands," she declared finally, as she stood, seemingly to abruptly leave. "I will speak with my son about your proposal. I agree the money would set him up for life, but I believe he will choose to marry for love and a happy life," he said as he helped her with the steps, and she crossed the track covered by her carpet to the carriage. The older man helped her back into her carriage, dazzling as it was in the midday sun. "I need to know by Friday, and it will all remain between us until their wedding day. I can't abide gossip," she called out of the carriage as the horses pulled away and she disappeared out of sight. William stood, bemused and confused at what had just happened. With just 2 weeks to go until his wedding, could William really throw this suggestion at his son? He knew he had to. He had never lied to his son and had always encouraged him to be independent and make his own choices in life, even if he made the wrong ones at times. William's wife had told him on her deathbed that their son should always have a say in his life. They were not to live it for him, and he had stuck by that agreement. He knew he had no choice but to discuss it with him that evening and risk the young Miss Jones being broken-hearted. Chapter 7. "I suspect you didn't get much sleep last night, son," William asked John that morning when he arose and entered the kitchen. John was confused. "Thinking about your options," William reminded him, showing frustration that his son never seemed to take anything seriously. "Oh, no. I decided quickly that I will marry Mrs. Temple's daughter." "What's her name again?" John asked as he poured himself a cup of coffee and offered one to his father, who declined. "Elizabeth. Are you sure about that, John? Have you really thought about it? What about Daisy?" John remembered his father saying he would not influence his decision the night before. That seemed to have changed now, he thought, bemused. "Oh, she'll get over it," John announced, a smile on his face. "What's more important is all that money, Father. You will be able to retire, and I will be able to grow the accounting firm." John knew that his father couldn't argue that the money would certainly come in handy. And although Daisy was beautiful, she wouldn't be bringing anything of real value to their marriage. He would finally be able to pay off his gambling debt too, which his father and Daisy knew nothing about. Although he had heard that Elizabeth was not much to look at, he knew that he would be able to keep her happy with just the right amount of attention, while he went about his own life in the arms of more attractive women. With the extra income, he could up the stakes on gambling and make even more money, he reasoned. He thought it best not to mention this particular intention to his father, who had always been so boring and straight-laced, especially since his mother had died. There had been no sign of a girlfriend on the scene at all. "And you're happy to keep it a secret until your wedding day?" his father asked him, repeating one of the strange conditions put forward by Mrs. Temple. Yes, yes, of course. I'm not going to be shouting about it, am I? It is she who should be shouting it from the rooftops, he responded. She must know he was out of her league. She would be grateful to have him, which sounded like a good marriage to John. Well then, we will go up to their house and give them the news today. Work can wait an hour, William declared. Yes, sir, and then if you can hold the fort, I will break the news to Daisy. I will simply tell her I have changed my mind and that things don't feel right between us. She doesn't need to know any more than that, John replied, eager to not drag this out. He knew Daisy would be devastated to lose him, but he had to let her know sooner rather than later. Chapter 8. Daisy awoke feeling exhausted. She had only managed a few hours of sleep following the devastating visit from John. She had cried well into the night, her father by her side for most of it. When he thought she had drifted off, he had crept out and gone to his bedroom. Daisy was glad to be alone for a little while, so she could really let it out. How could he just break off their engagement so close to the wedding? Anna had been of little help, as usual. When John had left and Daisy had to tell her parents what he had said, her mother had silently stared into space while Matthew consoled their daughter. She lay in bed, thinking of how stupid she had been to stay with him after she had found out about the affairs. She deserved better than that. She wondered how many people in the town knew about his indiscretions. She felt ashamed and embarrassed about being left at the altar. Very nearly. How could she tell people? They must already think her a fool for putting up with the affairs. After being awake most of the night, Daisy had concluded that all that was left for her to do was to leave town. She couldn't bear the humiliation and needed to get away somehow. She just didn't know how to go about that, yet she had to make it happen. Daisy heard a knock on the door downstairs and immediately remembered that her dear friend Mary was expected for a dress fitting that morning. Of all the days, she jumped out of bed and threw her robe around her, eager to get to Mary before her mother did. I don't know if she is going to be up to visitors, Mary, her mother was saying as Daisy rushed into the kitchen. She could see the confusion on her friend's face, obviously thinking her mother had gone quite mad. It's all fine, Mother, she said as she approached the door and pulled her friend in by the hand, past her mother and towards the stairs. I will come down for some coffee shortly, she said to her mother as the pair made their way up the stairs and to her room, her mother looking aghast in their wake. Daisy ushered Mary into her room and closed the door quickly. What on earth is going on? Your ma is normally a bit unusual, but that was extreme, even for her, Mary joked. Daisy could hold it together no longer. She burst into tears, sobs racking her body and hurting her throat. Whatever is the matter? Asked Mary, as she put a protective arm around her friend. Between sobs, Daisy managed to tell Mary that John had called off their wedding, fearing it didn't feel right. She went through a range of emotions as she told her friend what he had done to her, from sadness for losing the man she loved to anger that she had forgiven his previous misdemeanors. I simply must get away from here, Mary. How can I show my face in town now? The shame is just too much, she cried, her blue eyes blotchy and red. You have nothing at all to be ashamed of, Daisy. It is he who has done wrong, not you. You should hold your head up high, she reassured an unconvinced Daisy. That may be true, but it's not how I feel right now, she said sadly. She wanted nothing more than to be far away from this place. But what will you do? Where can you go? Mary asked, concern upon her pretty face. Daisy could not answer. She had no answer. She threw herself onto her pillow and cried again. I'm going to get us that coffee. I'll be right back, Mary said as she hopped off the bed and left the room. With a few minutes alone to think, she replayed everything that had happened over the previous day. She could not believe she had been so willing to forgive and forget, and so keen to marry a man who would treat her that way. She felt as though she would be a laughingstock. She would certainly be the talk of the town. Mary returned with coffee for them both, and Daisy accepted her cup gratefully. How was my mother? She asked Mary, fearful she had been confronted again. She was fine. She's upset. For you, I think. But also about the wedding that won't go ahead now, Mary explained. Daisy expected no less from her mother, worrying about herself as usual. She had been so looking forward to the fortunes that would come from Daisy marrying into the Smithers family, and had spoken of little other than the societal advantage it would give her. She rolled her eyes at Mary, and they both smiled, unsurprised by her mother's reaction. You know, I was thinking while I made the coffee. There is a way that you could get away from here, but it is unusual, Mary said, a twinkle in her eye. What is it? Nothing dangerous or illegal, I hope. Daisy replied, half joking. Mary laughed. No, not at all above board. There is a newspaper called the Matrimonial Times. Men who are looking for a wife place advertisements in it, and women write to them to see if they are compatible. If they are, a proposal is made and the woman travels to meet and marry the man. A friend of mine did it and she said she is very happy. Daisy thought about it for a moment. She had never heard of this concept before and wondered if she could really marry a perfect stranger. Then she recalled she had been about to marry a man who had dropped her in a heartbeat. She nodded at her friend. That sounds just perfect, Mary. Thank you. Shall we take a walk into town and see if we can find this newspaper? Mary nodded her head and finished the last of her coffee. A few hours later, Daisy walked home with the newspaper tucked into her purse and a new sense of optimism. The townsfolk had already started talking. There were many glances in her direction, which Mary told her to ignore, but it was hard to. She hadn't expected that John would have already told people. He had obviously wanted to let the women of the town know that he was fully available again. She had tried to hold her head high and not spend too much time in town. Mary had gone home, so they had parted ways once she had the newspaper securely hidden. She wanted nothing more than to go straight to her room when she got home, but Daisy knew that would be unlikely, as she had managed to avoid chatting to her mother that morning thanks to the surprise visit from Mary. She placed her purse carefully on the sideboard and asked her mother if she would like to have a coffee with her, to which she nodded her head. What are you doing? Daisy asked her mother, who was sitting on a hard-backed wooden chair by the window in the kitchen. Oh, just thinking about what could have been. I should have been fixing your dress today, after measuring up for Mary, she stated, unashamedly thinking of herself again while her daughter was going through the actual trauma. She didn't answer. What could she say? Daisy brought the coffee cups to her mother and pulled a chair over so that she could sit with her. I'm sure I will get to wear your beautiful dress one day, Mother, she tried to reassure her, incredulous that this was the relationship they now had. Her mother shrugged as though she had lost all hope of this happening. Daisy was tempted to tell her mother about the Matrimonial Times, but she suspected her mother would not approve and would try to talk her out of it, so she kept quiet. They drank their coffees in silence, with her mother failing to ask how she was feeling. After what felt like an eternity, Daisy decided she had been sitting with her mother long enough to leave without seeming to be rude. She had drained her coffee a while back, so she picked up her cup and stood. Where are you going? Anna asked, looking alarmed that Daisy had moved. Just up to my room. It's been an emotional few days. I'm going to have a lie down, Daisy replied as she grabbed her purse, hoping her mother would not make a fuss. She nodded in her direction, her face morose and despondent, then returned her eyes to the fields beyond the window and her thoughts to herself. As she ascended the stairs, Daisy allowed herself to dream that this newspaper could hold the key to her happily ever after. She could find a man who would truly want her and treat her right. And she could finally escape this town, where she now had so many bad memories. She would, of course, miss her parents, particularly her father and her friend Mary, but they would visit each other and write to each other. She had to do this for herself. She sat on her bed and opened the crumpled newspaper, spreading it wide across her bed. There were pages upon pages of men seeking brides. It was quite overwhelming, and Daisy struggled to know where to start. Some of the advertisements were lengthy with lots of information. Others were short, supplying just the basic information. Daisy scrolled the pages, feeling a little lost and out of her depth when she spotted a relatively small advertisement that stood out to her. A 30-year-old Texan widower with a perfect 2-year-old daughter seeks a fun-loving, kind, and caring woman to be his wife and her mother. If this is of any interest to you, please write to me. Yours, Edward Black. Texas ranch owner. This sounded like the kind of man Daisy should be with, someone who wanted her to be herself, and the fact that he had a child did not sway her decision at all. It sounded as if the pair had been through a great deal, if he was already widowed and left with a 2-year-old. Her stomach was alive with excitement, but not in the way it had been when she had felt uneasy. This was different. This was a definite excitement building within her, and she was pleased to have a distraction from John and what he had done to her. Daisy decided to write to him straight away. She didn't want to waste time, or to have too much time to think about it and change her mind. So, she collected her paper and pencil from her top drawer and sat at her vanity table. Dear Mr. Black, I happened across your posting in the Matrimonial Times, and I very much wanted to write to you straight away. I hope this suits you. A 2-year-old daughter sounds like much fun, and I am sure she will be keeping you busy, along with your cattle ranch. I have never been to Texas, but I have heard the weather is meant to be better there than it is here in New York State. I would very much like to hear from you if you would like to get to know me. I have enclosed my address, and I would dearly love to hear more about your daughter. Regards, Daisy Jones. Daisy reread her words and promptly folded the paper and pushed it gently into the envelope, writing the address on the front perfectly to be sure it reached its destination. She would walk into town with her father the next morning when it was still early and mail her letter. Hopefully she wouldn't see many of the townsfolk at that time of the day. Chapter 9. Edward had received more letters than he had expected after placing his advertisement, but so far none of the respondents seemed suitable for him and his daughter. Of course, his friend Jake thought he was being too selective, and maybe he was, but he reasoned he would have to spend the rest of his life with the woman, so he needed to be absolutely sure. Or as sure as could be. Caring for Annabella was becoming more and more challenging while he tried working the ranch. The ranch hands helped out too, but she needed a woman's care really, and certainly more attention than any of them could pay her on the busy ranch. He watched her closely as she rushed down the dirt track, as they did each morning to check the mailbox and collect the eggs from the chicken coop. She was becoming a fast little thing and liked to get her hands into everything, which is what his mother had said he was like when he was that age. Edward missed his parents dearly. He wished he could just see them both one last time, that they could meet their granddaughter. They would have been wonderful with Annabella, and she would have loved them. He had been very fortunate as a child, as his parents had always given him everything they could, and they had always been happy. He wanted that life for his daughter, but so far it could not have been further from that. He opened the mailbox, surprised to see a small envelope inside. Annabella had already spotted it and was jumping up and down impatiently, wanting to reach for it. He lifted her gently so she was just high enough, and she quickly put her little hand around the envelope and tugged it out. Feet back on the ground, there was no way she was giving up the letter, which he had now seen was addressed to him. He would wait until she had lost interest, for he knew all too well the consequences of taking something from her. Later that day, as Edward was putting his daughter down for her afternoon nap, he spotted the letter underneath her crib. Once she was sound asleep, he dared to reach for it, and with no movement from the sleeping baby, he crept out of the room, letter in hand, and made his way to the porch with a coffee. He enjoyed reading the letter, which was from a Daisy Jones. She seemed like a friendly person from what he had read, and in honesty, this was the first time he had felt any kind of connection from a first letter. He decided to write back straight away. He and Annabella were taking a walk into town later that day, when she awoke, so he could mail it then. He had all 5 ranch hands, so they were already prepared to manage without him that afternoon. He was grateful for the help with the cattle from hands who he could trust. He crept into the house and collected his paper and pencil, not wanting to wake his daughter just yet. Once back outside on the porch, he held the paper on the wooden frame while he wrote as neatly as possible. Dear Miss Jones, I wonder if I may call you Daisy, or is it too soon to be so informal? I am very happy for you to call me Edward. Mr. Black just makes me think of my father. I enjoyed reading your letter. Thank you for writing to me. My daughter is called Annabella, and she certainly is a good deal of fun, but also can be a bit of a handful at times, especially when I am trying to work and take care of her. I have some ranch hands who help me out, but we're not really cut out for looking after a little girl, I'm sure. I like it in Texas, but then I have never been anywhere else, so there is nothing to compare it to. Today is a bright and sunny day, not a cloud in the sky. There's not an awful lot to know about me, to be honest. My parents passed away when I was 19, and my wife died during childbirth, so it's pretty much just me. And my good friend Jake, who is the one who put me up to placing an advertisement in the first place. I wonder if you would like to tell me more about yourself. What are your folks like, and what does your father do? Are you an only child? How old are you? Please don't feel any pressure, though. Tell me whatever you would like to. I look forward to receiving another letter from you. Regards, Edward. Edward felt a sense of excitement as he sealed the envelope in preparation to mail it. The previous respondents he had received letters from had not been as interesting as this Daisy Jones. They had all sounded very formal and uninteresting. He had only replied to a few, but on their second letters he had decided not to write anymore. He didn't want to give anyone the wrong impression or waste anyone's time. But this one felt different. She showed a genuine interest, and she sounded fun, which was just what he and his daughter needed in their life. Edward knew Jake would be smug about this one if it turned out that he had been right to get him to place that advertisement. Chapter 10. Is that another letter from him? Daisy's father asked, not even hiding his disdain. Yes, I think it is, although I haven't opened it yet. I just found it in the box, she replied honestly, but she recognized Edward's writing as this would be the fourth letter she had received from him. She had been so looking forward to it arriving. He seems nice. What have you got against him? She asked as she sat down on the porch with him. He sighed and thought for a moment before responding. It's not that I have anything against him. I'm just sad that you might move all the way to Texas and leave me here. I'd miss you, he admitted. And I would miss you too, Daddy. But I have to live my life. I can't stay single forever. I want my own family. I want my own happily ever after, she tried to explain to him. I'm so angry at that waste of space, John Smithers. If he hadn't treated you so badly, you wouldn't be thinking of moving across the country, he stated, anger seeping into his voice. That may well be true, but I think you and I both know that John Smithers was never going to treat me right, she said quietly, suspicious that her father had heard what the gossipers had been saying in town. There was not much he didn't hear, being the only grocery store owner there. He nodded his head in reluctant agreement and placed a protective and loving arm around his daughter. You know I will love and support you, no matter what you decide to do, he reassured her. Well, he sure hasn't made any proposal just yet, so stop getting yourself all excited, she joked with him. Daisy had decided to tell her mother and father that she had replied to a mail-order bride advertisement a few days after she had received Edward's first reply. She had never really kept secrets from them and wanted their love and support to help her through this unfamiliar process. Her mother had explained that she was far too upset about the breakup to cope with anything else, and her father had been unconvinced by the whole thing. But at least she had been open with them, so there would be no surprises. Aren't you going to open that letter? He asked, gesturing towards the envelope on her lap. That could be the very proposal you speak of. She stood, gave her father a kiss on his forehead, and said she would take it to her room to read. Daisy skipped through the house, envelope clutched in her right hand. Once in the safety and privacy of her room, she tore the envelope open as fast and carefully as she could. She held her breath as she read. Dearest Daisy, Thank you for your most recent letter. I must say they have fast become the most exciting part of my life, apart from the wonder that is Annabella, of course. I have been talking to Annabella about you, and she has started to say your name. It sounds so sweet coming from her. I can't wait for you to hear her say it. This brings me nicely on to a question I would like to ask you. We have been talking through letters for a few months now. I like you, and I think you like me too. I wonder if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife. I will not rush you, of course, as I know you have a life there and will need to make preparations to leave. But I would be delighted if you accept my offer and make the 4-day journey to us when you deem fit. I have done some research and can tell you that the train leaves New York State every Tuesday morning and arrives in Texas on a Friday evening. I very much look forward to your response. Yours, Edward. Daisy could not believe her eyes. It had finally happened, and she could not be happier. She still felt animosity towards John for his treatment of her, but it felt different with Edward. He seemed kinder, even though she had not met him yet. She knew Step Trang. She knew instantly that she would accept his proposal, so she collected her paper and pencil and wrote back to accept. She didn't want to keep him in suspense any longer than she had to. Dear Edward, your letter has brought me incredible joy, and I would be absolutely delighted to accept your proposal. I am excited for us to begin our life together and cannot wait to meet your daughter and get to know her. I will need a little time to let my family and friends know and to pack my belongings, but I aim to be on the train this coming Tuesday. I hope this is in order, as I realize you won't have the opportunity to write back to me by then, so I hope to see you at the train station a week on Friday. I look forward to seeing you very soon. Yours, Daisy. As it was now Wednesday, Daisy had almost a week to get all her intended informing done and to get her things together in time to board the train on Tuesday. She was excited to start her new life and to meet the little girl who would be her daughter and the man who would be her husband. Daisy placed the letter in the envelope and meticulously wrote, for the last time, Edward's address, so as to ensure it got to him. She would mail the letter first thing in the morning, bright and early when her father set off to open the store. She could hear her mother and father talking downstairs and decided it would be best to get it over and done with, so she made her way down the stairs. They stopped talking and both looked at her when she walked through the door, making it apparent that they had been talking about her, yet again. Was your letter all you had hoped it would be? Her father asked with genuine interest and less of the disdain he had shown earlier. Actually, I'd really like to talk to you both about it. There was a glance exchanged between her parents before they all took their places at the dining table. Edward has indeed proposed to me in this letter. I am to accept his proposal and have my letter ready to send to him in the morning. I would really like your blessing. She out to them tentatively. Silence descended over them for a few moments before her father mercifully broke it. I would have liked to have met the man who will take my daughter's hand in marriage, but I do like all you have told me about him, and he does seem to be making you happy, so you have my blessing, but we must be at the wedding. Oh, Father, thank you for understanding, she exclaimed, before looking towards her mother, ready for her response. I am still not over you and John breaking your engagement. And you are moving on so fast, Anna said, her expression morose. Anna, we talked about this, her father interrupted, which led to her mother shifting in her seat and clearing her throat. But this isn't about me. It is about you, and if this is what is right for you, then we are behind you every step of the way, her mother finished, much to Daisy's astonishment and relief. Her father must have given her a good talking to after her performance over the recent months. Chapter 11. John had spent time with Elizabeth, his bride-to-be, and he had realized during this time that no amount of money would make it worthwhile marrying someone so dull and unattractive. She had instantly become demanding and jealous, wanting to know his every move. This had ruined his plan of having affairs once they were married. She had put pay to that, and she wanted to know where every penny was spent. She was more frugal even than his father. At least Daisy had always known her place. Had Elizabeth sported Daisy's looks, it would have been much more bearable, but she did not, so it simply would not work. And so he found himself again on the doorstep of the Jones home. But he was confident this time it would go much better. "Good evening, Mr. Jones," he said when Daisy's father opened the door, a look of anger crossing his face when he realized the identity of their visitor. "What can we do for you, young man?" he asked brusquely, with no intention of inviting him in. John couldn't even see past his stocky form whether Daisy was in the kitchen beyond him. "I would like to see Daisy, if that would be all right, sir?" John asked politely. He knew he needed to make a good impression and get back in their good books. "Matthew, let him in." John heard Mrs. Jones call from behind as she approached the door and opened it further to allow him access. "Hello, John. How are you? This is a lovely surprise. Shall I get Daisy for you?" John nodded his head in agreement. "Yes, please, ma'am. Thank you," he responded, his confidence boosted by the warm welcome. "Matthew, make some fresh coffee," Anna called back as she rushed up the stairs to beckon Daisy. He could hear the women's muffled voices but couldn't tell what they were saying. No doubt Daisy was excited by his visit and frantically changing into something more suitable in which to receive him. The pair appeared in the doorway. She looked as beautiful as always. She certainly was an attractive woman, and he realized what a mistake he had made by ending things with her in favor of Elizabeth. Not that Daisy knew anything about Elizabeth. No one did. No one was to know until their wedding day. He knew he needed to break that off somehow, too. "Yes?" Daisy asked somewhat rudely. "Daisy," her mother admonished her as her father glanced around at them all. "I wondered if we could have a conversation, please, Daisy," he requested. "A private conversation," he added, not wanting to discuss this in front of her parents, particularly not her father. "Very well, but I don't have very long. We will sit on the porch," she asserted. This was not going as he had planned. He had thought she would be delighted by his presence. He followed her outside, where they each took a seat on a wooden chair. Matthew followed with their hot coffees, which he placed on the table nearby. "Will you be all right?" he asked his daughter. Of course she would be fine. She would be perfectly safe with him. What on earth was wrong with the man? "I will be fine. Thank you, Father. I will call you if I need you," she dismissed him without leaving an opening for an argument. An awkward silence hung between the young pair once they were left alone. John didn't really know where to start. He had assumed this was going to be much more straightforward, but she was not being as receptive as he had hoped. "I want to ask for your forgiveness, Daisy. I want us to try again. I was wrong. We are meant to be together. I miss you," John said as earnestly as could be. Chapter 12. Daisy should board the train to Texas the very next day, which, of course, she had not told John the previous night. She had not mentioned Edward to him at all. It was surely not his business. Her mind was in turmoil as to what she should do. She had listened to his pleas and his excuses, and she had told him she would need some time to take in all of what he had said. He promised he would wait for her to make her decision and that he wanted nothing more than to marry her. After he left, it was clear that her mother and father had heard everything. Anna was beside herself with excitement, whereas her father was quiet. "Oh, Daisy, of course you have to accept his apology. We all make mistakes. He has paid the price and is willing to take you back," her mother had spouted excitedly. "Take me back?" Daisy had repeated to her mother, incredulous at the absurdity of her mother's viewpoint. "Oh, you know what I mean," she replied before happily turning on her heel and leaving the room. "I will get the dresses out again," she called behind her. Daisy sat on the wooden chair at the table, adjacent to her weary-looking father. She sighed and lay her arms on the table, placing her head on top of them. She felt her father's big, safe hands reach across and touch her shoulders, just as he used to when she was a child. "What's going on in your head, kid?" he asked her quietly. "You don't need to do anything you don't want to. Don't you mind your mother," he reassured her. "I don't know what to do, Father. Can't you tell me?" she pleaded, lifting her head to look into his eyes. One minute she had no options, the next she had two men wanting to marry her. "No, honey, it doesn't work that way. You have to make this decision, and it's got to be right for you." Just remember what you told me about Edward and what you said about John. Weigh up the options, he suggested sensibly, his eyes full of love for his daughter. I am due to board the train to Edward tomorrow, father. Tomorrow, she cried. I know, but he will understand if you want to delay it for a week or so. You would just need to get word to him, he reasoned. But if I marry John, I get to stay here near you, Daisy remembered. I know, and that would surely be fine for me, having my little girl in the same town. But don't let that be the deciding factor. You have to do what will make you happy. Marriage is a lifelong decision, he advised wisely, and Daisy nodded her agreement. I'm going for a walk, Daisy told her father. As she was passing him, he stood and embraced her warmly. Whatever you decide will be just perfect, and I will always be on your side. Always, he said, which filled her heart. She walked aimlessly, her mind whirring with the many thoughts and questions in her mind. She knew she would not be traveling to Edward the next day. In the commotion of John visiting the previous day, she had quite lost her rhythm of packing and saying goodbye to her loved ones. Edward had always been so caring and thoughtful in his letters. But of course, she had never met him, and he could turn out to not be the man she believed him to be. On the other hand, John was unashamedly himself, and she knew what to expect. But could she live her life married to a man who had affairs? Or had John really changed, as he had said the previous day, because he had missed her so? Daisy thought about her failing to arrive as she had promised on Friday. She could imagine Edward's disappointment and confusion, but she simply couldn't leave the next day. She would write to him and let him know that there had been a delay, and she hoped to be there in the coming weeks, and that she would let him know for sure as soon as she knew. She wouldn't be able to tell him why. He would surely change his mind about marrying her if he knew the reason behind her indecision. And what of poor Annabella, who now knew that Daisy was due to travel to be with them? She was expecting to have a mother by the end of the week. Daisy's heart went out to her, but she knew her father was right, and she needed to take time to consider her options. Chapter 13. Daisy's heart began to race when the man on their doorstep told her father he had a telegram addressed to her and handed it over. She had tried to write to Edward several times, but she simply couldn't put her feelings into words, so she did not send any of the attempts she had penned. John had visited every day, bringing flowers and gifts to try to convince her of the kind of life she would have with him. She had to admit that she did like the attention and the gifts, but she also knew that was not what marriage and love were about. She didn't need any of that. She never had. But he did seem to be trying. Daisy, her father said, closing the door and turning back to the table where Daisy sat with her hot coffee in hand. A telegram for you, most likely off Edward, I would imagine. Did you send him that letter? He inquired as he handed the telegram over to her. No, father. I just couldn't quite put it into words. I know I should have, she replied apologetically in response to his disappointed expression. There is no need for you to apologize, Daisy, her mother called from behind them. Your situation changed, and he will just have to live with that. In her mother's mind, Daisy had accepted John's fresh proposal, and she was going full steam ahead with the wedding preparations. Daisy and her father had decided a few days before to just leave her to it. Sometimes it was just easier for the sake of a quiet life. While her mother was busy, Daisy could really think it through without her mother trying to convince her or influence her. She opened the telegram there at the kitchen table. With all her previous letters from Edward, she had rushed up to her room and opened them privately. But this felt different, and she knew she might need her father's support and strength. Dearest Daisy, I am feeling a little lost and confused that you did not get off that train as planned on Friday. I waited as long as was feasible. I even got on the train to look for you, but there was no sign. I understand now that you must have changed your mind, which is a shame because I thought we seemed to be such a good match. If only in our letters. Maybe I scared you off. I don't know. Maybe I will never know. I sincerely hope you are safe and well, and that no ill has befallen you that has prevented you from traveling to me. Maybe I will hear from you again one day. Yours, Edward Black. She passed the telegram to her father once she had read it. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she imagined his disappointment and sadness when she was not on that train. She couldn't believe she had put him through that. She had been brought up better than that and should have behaved differently. If only John hadn't come along and confused everything. If only her mother hadn't become so obsessed with moving to the higher echelons of society and pressured her accordingly. If only she had trusted her heart. Her father reached out across the table and held her hand for a moment, his eyes also filled with sadness for a man who did not deserve such treatment. Daisy couldn't bear it. She stood abruptly and declared that she was going for a walk. Daisy wandered aimlessly, deep in her own thoughts, before she found herself in town. She wondered if today was the day that Mary would be in town, but realized it was not. She would have gone to town the previous day for her weekly shop as she always did. She wished she could talk to her, but she didn't feel as though she had the energy to walk out to her house and then get all the way back home. She had not been eating or sleeping at all well since John's proposal, which meant that she was lacking in strength. "Are you all right, ma'am?" A voice asked as she held onto the rail by the park to steady herself, suddenly feeling lightheaded. Daisy looked up to find one of the temple girls looking down at her, expressionless. "Oh, sorry, I was just a little dizzy. It must be the heat," she replied, while she pulled herself back up and steadied herself, patting down her dress. "Why don't I get you a cup of coffee? Come on," she stated, not really giving Daisy any choice in the matter as she held her arm and guided her across to the tavern which she and Mary frequented. The lady got them a table and organized 2 drinks before sitting down opposite Daisy and introducing herself. "I am Elizabeth Temple. What's your name?" she asked, attempting a smile that Daisy could tell did not come naturally. She was obviously a kind and thoughtful woman, but she had not been blessed with the friendliest of faces. Daisy Jones," she replied shyly, quite confused as to how she now found herself sitting in the tavern having a coffee with a stranger. "Ah, yes, you live just outside of town, don't you?" Daisy nodded in response, feeling too weak to talk and grateful for the sugary coffee. "I live up in the big house on the edge of town. Do you know it? It's majestic," she stated proudly, and again Daisy nodded. Daisy listened as Elizabeth Temple told her just how wealthy her family was. That would be her mother and her sisters. She tried to look interested, but money had just never really been of much interest to her. Her father had always brought her up to value people and experiences over money. It seemed odd, therefore, that her mother was so keen to have more money and be in circles with people who had lots of it. "So, tell me about you. What's going on for you today?" she asked, pulling Daisy out of her thoughts. "Oh, nothing really. I have just not been eating or sleeping properly recently, and the walk must have taken it out of me," she tried to explain without going into too much detail. "This sounds familiar and very much like man troubles. I know, you see, because I am engaged to be married, but he can blow a little hot and cold at times. It can be confusing, but I am so happy to be finally marrying, and he is a dream," Elizabeth explained, clearly wanting to talk about herself and her upcoming wedding. Daisy really didn't feel like listening to someone else's love story right then, but she was polite and knew she had to look interested, especially as the woman had helped her out on the street. "He sounds wonderful," she replied, hopeful for the conversation to move on, or even better, for Elizabeth to decide to leave. "Perhaps you know of him. He is from town and works just up the way. John Smithers, of the Smithers Accountants, no less," she announced to a shocked Daisy. Daisy was aware that Elizabeth was still talking, but she could hear none of the words as her thoughts whirred around in her mind. How could he be engaged to be married to someone else? Was this why John had changed his mind and decided not to marry her in the first place? A better, wealthier offer had obviously come along, and he couldn't resist it. So why then had he come running back to her when he was still engaged to Elizabeth? Elizabeth, who clearly had no knowledge of any history between the pair, let alone more current updates? Daisy shuddered at the indecency of the man. "Are you all right?" asked Elizabeth suddenly, and Daisy suspected she had lost the color in her face again. "I'm fine, thank you, but I have to leave now. Thank you for your kindness, and good luck with your marriage," she replied curtly as she stood and left the tavern, walking as firmly and confidently as she could manage. As Daisy stumbled home, she couldn't believe how stupid she had been. She had seriously been considering taking John back. She could have lost Edward for good. She had always known in her heart that Edward was a far better man than John, but she had become carried away by the attention from John. She would never let that happen again. When she arrived home, her mother and father were seated at the table together, dinner cooking behind her mother. Daisy took a deep breath, not wanting to be confronted by her mother. She said hello and prepared to walk through to go to her room. "Daisy, come and sit," her father requested calmly. She started to say as tears filled her eyes again. "Please, Daisy, come and sit," her mother said, an unusual emotion in her voice, which made Daisy stop and turn to them. The telegram from Edward was in the center of the table between them. Her heart again filled with sadness as to what she had put poor Edward through. She sat with her parents at the table, unable to meet their eyes. The shame of what she now knew bore heavily on her. She knew she would need to tell them what she had discovered, but she was still trying to process it all herself. "Daisy, I shouldn't have pressured you about John," her mother began, much to Daisy's surprise. "You should be the one to decide who to marry, and I will not stand in your way." Daisy looked up as her father nodded encouragingly toward her mother, willing her to go on. "This," her mother gestured towards the telegram, "is beautiful. I am sorry I didn't listen to you when you told me how wonderful Edward is. He sounds caring, loving, and thoughtful, just like your father." Her voice trailed off, and Daisy noticed her dab her eyes as tears threatened to fall. This show of emotion was most out of character for her mother, and Daisy didn't really know what to do. So she simply looked from one to the other, before allowing her tears to openly fall and accepting their warm embraces. Once her tears had abated, she told them what had happened in town and all she had now learned about John Smithers. They were both shocked, although her father was not shocked that he would have gone for the money. Her mother apologized again for putting herself above the best interests of her daughter, and reiterated that whatever she chose to do, she would support her, just as her father would. Yet. Chapter 14. Daisy stepped onto the train. Her stomach churned with nervous excitement as she waved goodbye to her mother, father, and Mary, who stood on the platform waving back. Her mother dabbed her eye with a handkerchief. She had been like a different person since their talk. In fact, she had been like the woman she used to be when Daisy was younger. She didn't know what had brought about this change of heart. She knew it had something to do with the telegram from Edward, but she felt sure her father had also had a stern word with her, which maybe had brought her out of her obsession with wealth. Following her conversation with her mother and father, Daisy realized that she had to go to Edward. He was the man for her, and she had always known it truly. Her parents had agreed wholeheartedly. The following day, they had all gone into town together to purchase a ticket for Daisy, and a ticket each for her mother and father to travel 2 weeks later. The plan was for Daisy to go to Edward to make sure he would still accept her into his life after what she had done. Provided all was well, they would arrange for the wedding to go ahead 2 weeks later, when her mother and father would join them to celebrate and to meet Edward and Annabella. It was an elaborate plan, and Daisy hoped she could pull it off. She hauled her bag into the compartment she had been allocated, thankful to find that she had a travel companion. It would be a very long 4-day journey with no one to speak to. She smiled and said hello to the older lady, who returned her welcome warmly, and Daisy just knew they were going to have a lovely time. It took Daisy a little while to get herself settled and comfortable after the train had set off. She felt sad about leaving her parents and her best friend, but at least she knew she would be seeing her mother and father again in a few weeks. Sooner, if Edward didn't want to have anything to do with her. Daisy then began chatting with the older lady, Mrs. Hayton, and they found they had some things in common. Both were headed to Texas, and both loved to go out for nice long walks. They chatted with ease, which helped Daisy to get used to the unusual momentum of the train on the tracks. She had never been on a train before, so it was unfamiliar to her. When Mrs. Hayton went quiet, Daisy realized this was most likely because she was getting tired, so she stayed quiet too. She watched the world go by beyond the window and dreamed of what could be. She dreamed of being welcomed with open arms by Edward as she ran to him. She dreamed that his daughter accepted her immediately, calling her mommy, and their family would be complete. But she also couldn't help but think of the opposite scenarios. Perhaps Edward was angry and upset with her and would want nothing more to do with her. Perhaps he would turn her away. Her father had insisted that she have enough money on her to afford a train ticket back home should she need it. She also had enough money to stay in a tavern until she could board the next train back, should the need arise. She felt safer in this knowledge, as she knew she would not be stranded at least. Daisy thought of John again, still incredulous at how he thought he could treat people. She had written him a letter and knew her father would have delivered it to him by now, as he was taking it to the accounting firm immediately after her train had left. She was pleased with what she had written, as that man needed to know that he could not treat people so badly. John, I thought you should know. I have left New York State and am en route to Texas, where I shall marry a rancher. I was scheduled to go the day after you came to see me and asked me to marry you again, but you swayed my mind and made me rethink my plans. I discovered the truth about you just in time, thankfully, and now my mind will certainly not be swayed. The man I will marry is kind, honest, hardworking, thoughtful, and considerate. All the things that you are sadly not. I know about your indiscretions when we were engaged. I know about your obsession with becoming wealthy. I even know about your habits with gambling. None of these characteristics are what I would like in a husband. So I am glad I have had a lucky escape. I wish you and Elizabeth a marriage that befits you both. You certainly do make a good match, I must say. Goodbye, John. Daisy. She had even let her father read the letter. He suggested she could add some extra information to make her point all the more. But Daisy thought she had said enough, and she was saying it for her own closure, nothing more. Daisy imagined the cold reception John would have received when he met with her father that morning. She hoped there had been no altercation and that her father had not been upset by the situation. But she knew he would have done anything for her, and a disagreement would have been worth it for him, had it occurred. Daisy checked in her purse again to make sure she had Edward's address with her. She did, of course, and she knew she would check another 100 times before she arrived in Texas. But it made her feel safe to know she had it on her and would be able to find her way when she arrived. Chapter 15. Chapter 15. The train began to slow as it approached the platform. Daisy felt a knot in her stomach as she remembered she would not be met when she disembarked from the train as she should have been. She would have to find her own way to Edward's home. She gathered her belongings and followed Mrs. Hayton out of the compartment and into the long corridor where the doors would open out onto the platform. It was early evening, and she knew she would need to get organized with a ride to the ranch as quickly as possible, as she didn't want to risk Edward going to bed before she arrived and having to knock to wake him up. Daisy and Mrs. Hayton said their goodbyes and wished each other all the best as they got onto the platform, and Mrs. Hayton's son came rushing over to collect her bags. Daisy again felt grateful to have had such a lovely companion for the journey. The days had flown by, and she couldn't quite believe she was now in Texas. It was busy, and there seemed to be people everywhere. She followed the crowd in the direction they were going, struggling with her heavy bags at times. Once outside, it was clear where the horse and carts were to be found, and so she went directly to the front one and asked for a ride, giving them the paper bearing Edward's address. As they traveled, her anxiety began to grow at the possibility of being shunned and asked to leave. She hoped and prayed that he would be able to forgive her. He had been right in what he had written in the telegram. They would be a good match. She was certain of that now. The horse started to slow, and Daisy realized they were taking a turn down a dirt track. They must have arrived. She sat up straight and smoothed down her dress. She needed to look her best to win Edward over. She looked around in amazement. The ranch was huge, with a very large main house and a scattering of smaller holdings around the immediate homestead. She could see stables and fields upon fields, as far as the eye could see. As they pulled to a stop at the front of the house, the driver rushed around to help her down from the cart, and she made the payment. Daisy wondered if she should ask him to wait just in case she was not welcome. But she thought that might seem odd to the man, and he might have other work to get to. Daisy looked around and was about to climb the steps of the porch to knock on the door when she spotted a handsome, kind-looking man in a nearby field with a child at his feet. They were both looking at her, alerted by someone's uninvited presence. Edward picked up his daughter and began walking towards her. He quickened his pace as he got closer, and during that time, Daisy already knew she had made the right decision to come. The love she felt for him and Annabella was instant. "Daisy," he asked, eyes wide as he got closer. She nodded sheepishly, afraid of his reaction. She needn't have been. He smiled widely and embraced her warmly, Annabella between them, looking suspiciously at Daisy. "I hope you don't mind me turning up unannounced like this," Daisy said, feeling her cheeks blush with his gaze on her. She felt confident that he liked what he saw, and the feeling was mutual. "Mind? I am delighted. I have been so sad since you failed to show up," he replied. "Anyway, let's get inside. You've had a long journey. You must be ready for a good cup of hot coffee?" he asked, to which she nodded in agreement. Edward placed Annabella on the kitchen floor while he made the coffee on the large stove. Daisy chose to sit on the floor near Annabella. She smiled at the little girl, who seemed wary at first, but soon started to come around. Before she knew it, Annabella was on her lap and babbling to her, holding her face in her hands and squeezing her cheeks. Prosody rate 7%. "I see you two have become acquainted." Edward laughed as he placed the coffee cups on the wooden table in the center of the kitchen. "We only have about half an hour, unfortunately, before this one needs to go to bed," he told Daisy, who realized that this was Edward's way of saying they would talk after that. Daisy and Edward sat out on the porch once Annabella was tucked up and fast asleep. They sat close together on the 2 wooden chairs that overlooked the many buildings in the near distance, which she now realized were homes for the ranch hands and their families. She could make out people moving around, but was not close enough to see or hear them properly. "So," Edward started, the conversation needing to be had, "what happened, if you don't mind me asking?" She appreciated how polite and kind he was and thought this was sincere, not an act because she had just arrived. Daisy told him what had happened, how John had turned her head and how she had been tempted to stay where everything was so familiar. She wanted to be open and honest with him from the very start. He showed a number of emotions whilst she spoke, but mostly he looked concerned for her. "Well, I am sure glad you have come now," he exclaimed, a broad smile on his handsome, sun-kissed face. "I am too. I was worried you might be angry with me and turn me on my heels and send me back," she admitted. "Never. I have seen how fast Annabella has taken to you. You're not going anywhere," he joked. "You can't sleep in the main house until we are married, which we can talk about tomorrow. But I do have a small hold round the back, which is unoccupied at the moment, so you will be more than comfortable in there, I am sure." "Would that be all right?" he asked tentatively. "Absolutely. Thank you so much for your hospitality. About the wedding, though. My mother and father would like to be here for it and intend to come out in 2 weeks. Would that be in order?" she asked, a coy smile on her pretty face. "I don't think I will ever be able to say no to you," he stated, before looking away shyly. "That sounds just perfect, Daisy. Tomorrow you must write to them to confirm that this will go ahead, and then we can go into town and speak with the minister." They chatted late into the night as if they were old friends who had known each other for years. They laughed together and enjoyed each other's company. Daisy knew she was going to be happy here with Edward. As daylight had all but gone, Edward collected her bags and took her to where she would be sleeping for the next few weeks. He helped settle her in, making sure she knew where everything was, and then he bid her good night. A perfect gentleman. Daisy lay down and closed her eyes. She felt so delighted that she had made the decision to be with Edward and knew they were going to be very happy together. Chapter 16. Daisy waved frantically when she saw her mother and father through the train windows as the train came to a stop in front of her. Edward followed her as she walked up the platform to where her parents would get off. They disembarked, her father helping her mother down the steps once he had got their luggage off. Edward quickly stepped forward and offered his hand to Matthew, her father. He accepted with a big smile on his face, and the two men made their acquaintance. The previous few weeks had been just perfect for Daisy. She had really enjoyed getting to know Edward and Annabella. They had fallen into a lovely routine that they all enjoyed, and it meant Edward was better able to manage his work. She had also really liked getting to know the ranch hands and their families, enjoying the little community Edward had created in order to ensure his staff was well looked after. They spent a wonderful day with her parents, getting to know each other and having fun with the baby. Daisy felt so complete now that her parents had met and accepted Edward too. Even her mother was in awe of the size of the ranch. She had been quite unprepared, thinking her daughter was going to some shanty or other. The wedding was booked for 2 days hence, giving her parents a bit of time to settle in. Her mother had brought the wedding dress and wanted some time to fit it and make alterations, so it was like new for Daisy, as she didn't want to feel as though she was marrying Edward in the dress she should have worn to marry John. "I'm so proud of you," Daisy's father said that evening when they had a moment together. "You look so happy. A rancher's life seems to be a good fit for you." "You know me, Father? I love being outdoors. It really is perfect here. And because Edward has so much land and so many buildings, we can accommodate visitors, so you can come any time you want to. We will always have room," she replied, pleased they were able to put her parents up so they could be as close as possible. "Edward will treat you right. I can tell. He is a good man. Not like that good-for-nothing." He stopped abruptly as Daisy put her hand on his shoulder and shushed him kindly. "Hey, shush. It's all worked out for the best. That is in the past. John is in the past. I have told Edward all about him and what happened so that we don't have any secrets, but we really don't need to mention his name anymore. He is so insignificant," she smiled. "You're right. Look at you now. But you should have seen his face when I gave him your letter," he chuckled. "The color drained right out of him, right before my eyes. And when he had finished reading and looked up at me, I simply laughed and walked away," he shared, this being the first opportunity for him to tell his daughter. Daisy laughed. "That probably wounded his ego more than anything," she said, glad that there had been no negativity or altercation between the pair. Edward and Anna came out just at that moment, carrying a tray of drinks for them all. They toasted the happy couple with their whiskey tumblers and chatted into the night. Daisy was sure life could not get any better than this. Chapter 17. John could not believe the audacity of the woman. It had taken a lot of courage for him to go to his mother-in-law to ask for money. She had laughed in his face and told him in no uncertain terms that he had married her daughter, and it was now his responsibility to look after her. He had been married to Elizabeth for just over a year. It was not a happy marriage. They did not like spending time together, nor did she like him to be out of her sight. Elizabeth was jealous and possessive and wanted to know his whereabouts at all times. It was suffocating. So, any time he could get away from her, he would, and he would inevitably end up gambling. His debts had mounted, and he had been struggling to stay afloat. Since his father had retired 6 months earlier, the business had not been doing as well. There was a new accountant in town that was cheaper, so the stupid townsfolk were choosing to make use of their services instead. He knew he offered more value for money, but he had to let them go their own way. They would come back to him at some point. His father had tried to tell him that his customers needed an accountant who was nice to them, but he had laughed that off. Business isn't about being nice. So John had carried on, refusing to bend to anyone else's rules. The accounting firm was not making any money as a result. John felt as though everything was crashing down around him, and nobody would help him out. He had been forced to take on some menial work to just make ends meet, but it was hard. The hours were long, and he despised it. He was more suited to being behind a desk. His wife now accused him of being weak and pathetic. There was no attraction between the pair, and there had never been any physical relationship between them. So he was not due to have the family he had always wanted. He didn't even have the opportunity to have affairs, thanks to Elizabeth being so overbearingly possessive. He allowed himself to wonder about a life with Daisy. Had she not run off to marry a rancher? They could have been happy together, he thought. He could have lived the life that he had always dreamed of, and she would have supported him through thick and thin. It still smarted him that she had left him in the way she had. It seemed very unjust in his eyes. He was sure she was probably as miserable as he, although that wasn't the word about town. Epilogue. Daisy sat under the large oak tree, feeding their 3-month-old baby Joshua while Annabella took a nap in the shade. She felt so content with life and appreciated everything they had. Her good friend Mary had been to visit earlier that year, and Daisy was beyond excited that she would be arriving to spend Christmas with them the following month. She was on countdown already. Edward found the pair of them to be highly amusing when they were together. It was as though they had never been apart, and they talked and talked for hours. She watched as her husband strode across the lawn to them, as he did every lunchtime since they got married over a year ago. She had a picnic ready for him, so they would eat together before he went back out onto the ranch to do his afternoon work. He sat down beside her and sighed heavily. "Are you all right, Edward?" she asked, concerned at the big sigh, and wondering if he was overdoing it again. It was a busy time of the year for ranchers, apparently. "I'm more than all right, my love. I think somebody needs to pinch me, because this life seems pretty perfect to me. My beautiful wife feeding my baby boy while our little girl sleeps in the shade. How could life be any better?" "I have an idea of how it could be even better," she declared, a broad smile on her face as she gestured toward her stomach. "You're not? We're not?" He whispered, eyes wide. "I am, we are," she replied, as he jumped up and down and cheered for all the world to hear. Daisy laughed at his reaction. They hadn't planned to have another baby so soon, but babies often don't follow anyone's plan anyway. "What's happening?" asked an almost 4-year-old bleary-eyed Annabella, awoken by her father's excitement. "Mommy's going to have another baby," he declared excitedly, to which Annabella immediately got to her feet, also jumping around and cheering. Baby Joshua nursed, oblivious to the commotion going on around them. "Will it be a sister this time, Mommy?" Annabella asked earnestly. "Please, can you make it be a sister?" Her little face searched Daisy's for an answer. "I don't know whether it will be a girl or a boy, my love, but we will love it no matter what, won't we? And you will be the best big sister there ever was." Annabella nodded her head, ferociously in agreement. "I sure will, Mommy. I promise," she replied. Edward sat back down next to her, while Annabella ran frantically around the garden, excitement taking over after her slumber. "So, are you glad you didn't stay with that John and came to me instead?" Edward asked, a twinkle in his eye as he awaited the right answer from his beautiful wife. "John who?" she replied, a smile on her beautiful face as she stroked her newly pregnant stomach, and Edward rested his head on her sun-kissed shoulder.